tonight we asked a question so dangerous it was never meant to be spoken. What was the Vatican's biggest cover-up? Not a scandal, not a mistake, but a silence so deep it swallowed centuries. They say history is written by the victors. But what if it was rewritten by priests? By men in robes who controlled time, memory, and truth itself. For over 1,000 years, the Church shaped what the world was allowed to know. They erased entire centuries, buried maps that showed too much, banned books that asked the wrong questions, and locked the real story away behind stone walls. This isn't just about forgotten popes or missing years. It's about a carefully crafted illusion. A world where light only shines where the Vatican points it. So before we open the vault, ask yourself one thing. If the past was edited, what does that mean for everything we think we know? Like the video. Subscribe. Because tonight we don't just question history. We expose the ones who buried it. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that the entire world has gone quiet. No messages, no noise, just silence. That's what happened to history in the year 476. The Western Roman Empire fell, and something strange followed. Not war, not fire, just stillness. A curtain dropped over Europe, and behind it everything seemed to vanish. Cities faded, books disappeared. And time itself felt like it stopped breathing. You'd expect chaos, panic, a collapse that left screams echoing through the ruins of Rome. But there were no final cries, no grand last battle. Instead, the empire just slipped away. One boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus was removed from power by a general named Odoacer, and then it was over. The last lights of Rome went out, and no one seemed to notice. No statues torn down. No scrolls written to mark the end. It's like the story just stopped mid-sentence. What followed should have been a flood of new stories, new kings, new ideas. But instead, history dried up. The next few centuries are barely visible. Historians today call this period the Dark Ages. But if you look closer, you'll find something even stranger. It's not just dark, it's empty, like someone hit delete on 1,000 years of memory. We are told that during this time, Europe forgot everything. How to build, how to think, how to dream. But how does a whole civilization forget who it is, almost overnight? And why was the silence so complete? That's where the Vatican enters the picture. Because when Rome fell, it wasn't a king or an army that stepped in. It was the Church. The Christian faith, still young and hungry for power, began to spread across the ruins. And it didn't just offer hope, it offered control. While cities burned and libraries crumbled, the Church gathered what remained and locked it away. In those early days, monks became the new scribes of history. But they didn't copy everything, only what fits the new story. They rewrote the past to match their beliefs. They translated ancient knowledge into a language only they could read, and they made sure that anything dangerous was either erased or locked up where no one else could find it. That is why the silence matters, because it wasn't just the silence of war, it was a silence of design. Someone wanted the world to forget, to wake up in a world where only one voice remained. And that voice spoke Latin, from behind stone walls, in the name of God. So the real question isn't just what happened when Rome fell, it's who decided what we'd remember, and who made sure that everything else was never spoken of again. This is where our story begins, not in a battle, not with a hero, but with a whisper so quiet it almost disappeared, until now. When Rome collapsed, it didn't leave behind a clear new ruler. There was no single kingdom ready to rise, no empire waiting in the shadows. Instead, Europe crumbled into fragments. Cities fell quiet. Roads cracked and faded. Trade routes disappeared. It was as if the world had taken a step back in time. Everything that once made life organized and connected was suddenly gone. But in the middle of all that chaos, one thing survived. One structure remained untouched. It wasn't a palace or a fortress. It was the church, not yet called the Vatican, not yet dressed in robes of gold and power. But it was there, quiet, watching, and, most importantly, waiting. While kings came and went, and warlords fought over scraps of land, the church offered something no one else could: stability. It didn't need armies, it had faith. It didn't build cities, it built beliefs. And as the old world burned around it, people began to cling to that belief, like a raft in a storm. The church didn't just survive the fall of Rome, I used it. In a time when no one trusted rulers or laws, people turned to priests. In a world with no books or schools, people listened to sermons. And while the ruins of the empire turned to dust, churches were built in their place. Little by little, the church became more than a religion. It became the only voice of authority. It controlled not just the soul, but the village, the land, the law. Priests weren't just holy men. They were judges, scribes, and teachers. If you wanted to marry, confess, be buried, or even learn your own name, you had to go through them. And behind those priests, rising higher with each passing year, was a growing centre of power in Rome, what we now call the Vatican. Back then, it was just the church's headquarters. But soon, it would become something far greater. A spiritual empire rising from the ashes of a fallen one. But the power it built wasn't loud. It didn't take cities by force. It took them with stories, with symbols, with rituals, and by offering hope in a world that felt lost. The church promised salvation. But in return, it asked for obedience, not just to God, but to itself. So as Europe stumbled in the dark, the church lit a single candle and said, "Follow." And people did, not because they had a choice, but because there was nothing else. And while everyone else was just trying to survive, the church was building something bigger. It was rewriting history, redefining truth, becoming not just the guide for the soul, but the guardian of memory. This is how the Vatican rose, not from battlefields, but from silence. It became the last standing authority because it knew something no one else did, that when the world forgets, whoever holds the story becomes king. Before the fall of Rome, knowledge flowed like a river. Scholars debated in open forums. Libraries stored scrolls filled with math, science, medicine, and philosophy. Students studied under masters in places like Alexandria and Athens. Education wasn't just for priests, it was for citizens, for thinkers, for builders. It was for anyone willing to ask a question and chase the answer. But when the empire collapsed, that river dried up. Schools closed their doors, teachers vanished. Libraries were burned or abandoned, and the people who once passed knowledge from one mind to another were scattered. Some fled, some stayed silent, others simply disappeared into the fog of a new world that no longer had a place for them. In that silence, a new power stepped forward: the monasteries, quiet stone buildings hidden in the hills, run by monks who had taken vows of silence, discipline, and faith. And most importantly, they had taken control of what was left of the ancient world's knowledge. They didn't steal it, they preserved it, but only the parts they chose, and only in ways that served their purpose. Secular education, the kind that asked big questions about the universe, politics, or the human body was gone, replaced by religious schooling that focused on obedience, prayer, and scripture. If you wanted to learn now, you had to join a monastery, and once inside, you were taught what to think, not how to think. The works of thinkers like Aristotle or Galen were no longer studied openly. If they survived at all, they were rewritten in Latin, often stripped of anything that contradicted church doctrine. And since Latin was now controlled by the church, only those trained by the church could even read the texts. Outside those walls, ordinary people were left in the dark. Entire generations grew up never learning to read or write. The few who did often became part of the church itself, further tightening its grip over what could be known and who could know it. This wasn't just about books, it was about power. Because once the church controlled education, it controlled the future. It could decide which facts survived and which were forgotten. It could shape minds from childhood. And it could erase the past simply by refusing to copy it. The death of the scholar wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in one day. It was slow, quiet, but devastating. A world that once celebrated debate and discovery became one where silence was safer than curiosity. And so, the memory of a brighter time faded. The names of philosophers, doctors, inventors were slowly lost, and the only stories left were the ones told by the men in robes behind monastery walls. That is how knowledge changed hands, not through violence, but through silence. And in that silence, a new kind of authority was born, one that didn't need armies. Just ink, parchment, and a locked room. Language is how we remember. It's how we pass on knowledge, ask questions, and tell the truth. But what happens when the words we use are no longer our own? What happens when a language becomes a lock instead of a key? After the fall of Rome, the church stepped into the empty space left behind, and with it came a new kind of language, ecclesiastical Latin. It wasn't the Latin of Cicero or Julius Caesar. It was different, narrower, stricter, designed not for poetry or science, but for prayer, obedience, and control. This version of Latin became the official voice of the church, the only language allowed in sacred texts, sermons, and scholarly work. If a book wasn't written in it, it was considered unworthy. If an idea couldn't be expressed through it, that idea was dangerous. Over time, the older forms of knowledge written in Greek, classical Latin, or other ancient languages were either destroyed or rewritten. But when they were rewritten, they weren't just translated. They were edited, changed, simplified, twisted to fit the church's view of the world. And here's the trick. Only monks trained by the church could read or write ecclesiastical Latin. It wasn't taught in village schools. It wasn't spoken in the streets. So even if a scroll survived, even if it held powerful knowledge, the average person would never understand it. They weren't meant to. That's how language became a prison. It locked the truth behind words that only a chosen few could read. And it gave the church total control over what people believe. Because if you can't read the past, you can't question the present. Imagine being told your soul depended on a book you couldn't read, in a language you couldn't speak. Imagine your entire world being shaped by someone else's interpretation. That was the reality for millions of people. Their understanding of life, death, the stars, even history itself, came second-hand from a priest reading a book they were never allowed to open. Ecclesiastical Latin wasn't just a tool, it was a wall, a barrier that kept ancient truths hidden and made sure only the church could decide what was real. And the deeper you go, the more you realize how effective it was. Revolutionary ideas about medicine, the structure of the universe, even democracy, were lost for centuries simply because they couldn't be translated into the language of control. Or worse, they were twisted into something unrecognizable. This was not an accident, it was a design, a quiet strategy to filter the past and reshape the future. And by keeping that language locked in the mouths of priests and monks, the church didn't just protect its power, it shaped reality itself. So the next time you hear Latin echoing through a cathedral, remember this. Sometimes what sounds like light is actually a script written in shadows. And sometimes the deepest truths are the ones no one is allowed to read. It started with smoke, not from war or wildfire, but from pages, ancient scrolls, rare manuscripts, books that held the thoughts of civilizations long gone. They didn't vanish by accident. They were burned, on purpose, and the ones who lit the flames wore robes. The church didn't just want to guide faith, it wanted to guide memory. That meant deciding which ideas could survive and which had to be erased. Anything that questioned official doctrine was labelled heresy. And heresy wasn't just a bad idea, it was a crime, a dangerous infection that had to be destroyed. So the books were hunted, one by one, from city libraries to private collections, from temples to hidden shelves in stone monasteries. Books about astronomy that said the earth moved. Books about healing that didn't rely on prayer. Books that asked what came before creation. All of it targeted, all of it is seen as a threat. Some were burned in public, a message to the people. Others disappeared in silence, locked away in vaults or quietly destroyed in candlelit rooms where no one could stop it. The goal wasn't just to stop bad ideas, it was to erase them completely, as if they had never existed. And it didn't stop at paper. Writers, thinkers, philosophers, anyone who dared to ask too many questions could be branded a heretic. Some were silenced with exile, others with fire. The Inquisition didn't need to prove you were wrong, it just needed to prove you were dangerous. The truth is, many of these books didn't challenge God, they challenged power. They gave people new ways to think, to heal, to see the stars, to understand themselves outside the church's control. That's what made them dangerous. Not the words themselves, but the freedom they represented. Imagine if someone today burned every science textbook, every medical journal, every work of philosophy, then replaced them with one single book and told you that everything you ever needed to know was inside. That's what happened during this purge. Except it wasn't just about limiting education. It was about erasing the past. We don't know how much was lost. We can't, because some books vanished without a trace. No copies, no titles, no memory, just ash. But we do know this. There are gaps in our timeline, breaks in knowledge, discoveries that seem to come centuries too late, as if we had to start over, again and again. And in the centre of that silence stands the Church, holding the one book that was never burned, declaring it the only truth, declaring everything else a lie. Burning the past wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, a way to make sure the future belonged to the ones who held the match. And in those flames, 1,000 voices were silenced. Not just stories, but science, art, questions. And what's worse than not knowing the truth is never even knowing it existed. Once upon a time, libraries were treasure houses. Not of gold or jewels, but of ideas. Scrolls stacked in columns. Books copied by hand. Knowledge stretching back to Egypt, Greece, Persia, and beyond. They held the voices of poets, doctors, scientists, engineers, dreamers, and then, one by one, they vanished. Not all at once, not in a single disaster, but slowly, quietly, as if the world was forgetting on purpose. After Rome fell, many of its great libraries were abandoned. Some were looted, others left to rot. But the truly dangerous ones, the ones that held secrets, discoveries, or ideas too bold for the new world, didn't just disappear. They were taken. And where they went, the trail goes cold. Some believe the church rescued them, protected the knowledge from destruction. But protection can become possession, and possession becomes control. Monasteries began collecting books from all over Europe, not just religious texts, everything. And instead of sharing them, they locked them behind stone walls, copied what they liked, burned what they feared, changed what didn't fit. Over time, entire libraries were erased from memory, and the people who once read them silenced by the passing of years. It's easy to blame war or time, but when you look closer, you'll see patterns. Books vanish right as their ideas begin to challenge church teachings. Entire collections seized under the excuse of heresy. Cities raided, not for land or gold, but for scrolls. Some of the most famous ancient texts were only rediscovered centuries later, hidden in monastery basements, mislabeled or almost unreadable. Others were never found again, as if they had been swallowed whole by the earth. This wasn't random. It was a kind of cultural amnesia, a planned forgetting, and the Church, especially the Vatican, held the eraser. Imagine growing up in a world where the only books allowed were the ones someone else approved. Imagine not knowing that a better cure existed, that a map once showed lands no longer on record, that someone long ago already solved the question you've been told is impossible. That's what happened to Europe. 1,000 years of forgetting, because libraries didn't just vanish, they were replaced with silence, with scripture, with a version of history that pointed in only one direction. And in that silence, the church grew stronger. Because if people couldn't remember another way, they couldn't imagine one. We'll never know exactly what was lost. Not completely. But we can feel the missing pieces. The sudden jumps in progress that don't make sense. The gaps in records. The voices that should have shaped the world, but were buried before they ever had the chance. When libraries vanish, it's not just pages that go missing. It's perspective, memory, possibility. And the most dangerous thing you can do to a person is take away what they used to know. Because once you erase the past, you can rewrite the future however you want. Picture a long stone table lit by flickering candlelight. A hooded monk sits quietly, dipping his pen into ink, copying a manuscript word for word. But then he pauses. His eyes move across the line. Something in the text doesn't match church teaching. Maybe it's a reference to an ancient goddess, or a claim that the earth moves around the sun. He scratches it out. Replace it. Keep writing. Just like that, the truth is gone. During the Middle Ages, the keepers of history weren't historians. They were monks. Men who lived in silence, worked in shadows, and held the past in their hands. But they didn't just copy texts. They edited them. And in those edits, the world was slowly reshaped. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a missing word, a flipped sentence, a whole paragraph quietly skipped. Over time, these changes added up. Pagan gods became devils. Scientific theories became blasphemy. Philosophers were rewritten as fools or sinners. And anything that challenged the church's version of the world was edited out of existence. The monks believed they were protecting the truth. They weren't trying to lie. they were preserving the soul of a broken world. But to do that, they had to clean up history, erase contradictions, silence uncomfortable questions, and polish the past until it reflected the image of their faith. Whole civilizations were reduced to footnotes. Ancient rituals were twisted into cautionary tales. Women who once led and healed were rebranded as witches. And any culture that didn't fit into the Christian timeline was either ignored or labelled as lost. What was left behind was not a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. It was a carefully edited version of history, one that served a purpose, one that reinforced obedience, fear, and the power of the church. And because these monks were the only ones with access to the original texts, no one could challenge them. People couldn't read Greek or Hebrew. They couldn't compare translations. Most couldn't even read Latin. They had no idea what had been removed or changed. They just accepted what they were told. This was the era of holy editors. Quiet men with ink-stained fingers who decided what would be remembered and what would vanish. They turned messy, complicated history into a clean, sacred story. One path, one truth, one book to rule them all. And the changes they made still echo today. Our maps, our calendars, our understanding of the past, all filtered through the eyes of men who believed they were saving the world by trimming the parts that didn't fit. But history is not meant to be neat. It's supposed to be raw, full of questions and contradictions. When you edit it to fit a belief, you don't just change the past, you limit the future. So the next time you read an old story, ask yourself, is this what really happened? Or is it just what someone wanted me to believe? Time is supposed to be the one thing we all share. It moves forward second by second, day by day. We trust it, we build our lives around it. But what if the timeline we live by isn't real? What if history was stretched, bent, or even made up? After the fall of Rome, the church didn't just take control of faith. It took control of time. Calendars were rewritten, events rearranged, birthdays of emperors shifted, eclipses redated. And what started as confusion slowly turned into control. In the early Middle Ages, most people didn't have a fixed calendar. They marked time by harvesting moons or the reign of local kings. But the church wanted something more organised, something that tied all of Europe to its authority. So it introduced a new system, one based on the supposed birth of Christ, before Christ and after Christ, BC and AD. It sounds harmless, but it gave the church something powerful, the ability to say when things happened, or if they happened at all. Some historians today believe parts of our history might have been invented, entire centuries that don't match up, buildings too advanced for their time, documents dated to kings who never existed. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. And while it's controversial, the questions it raises are real. Why do some records from the so-called Dark Ages feel like copies of earlier ones? Why do certain royal lineages seem duplicated or out of order? Why do astronomical records from that period not match what the stars would have looked like? The answers might lie in who controlled the calendar. The church didn't just keep time, it was crafted. Popes could move holidays, change the length of months, even erase days entirely. And when you control the structure of time, you can shape memory itself. Imagine adding 200 years to a timeline. Suddenly, your institution looks older, wiser, more divine. You can claim prophecies were fulfilled, that saints lived in times they never did, that history always pointed toward your truth. Most people didn't question it. They couldn't read. They didn't travel. They didn't have clocks or charts. They trusted the church to tell them what year it was, what day to pray, when to plant, when to fear. And once the church's version of time became official, everything else had to match royal records, scientific theories, even the rise and fall of empires, all forced into a timeline that may not be real. We like to think the past is set in stone, but history is a puzzle made of documents, dates, and memory. And if someone has the power to control those pieces, they can shape the entire picture. The timeline we follow might feel solid, but dig deep enough and cracks appear. And behind those cracks is a story not of what happened, but of what we were told to believe happened. A story written not by time, but by those who claim to speak for God. There was a time when asking the wrong question could get you killed. Not because it was evil, not because it hurt anyone, but because it challenged the story the church wanted the world to believe. This was the time of the Inquisition, a time when thoughts were dangerous and memory itself was put on trial. It didn't start with fire, it started with whispers. Someone in a village says the earth might move around the sun, or that a saint never existed, or that a book says something different from the priest's sermon. That whisper would be passed from mouth to mouth until it reached the church. And then the real fear began. You could be summoned, no explanation, just taken. Dragged into a cold room by men in robes with eyes that never blinked. And once you were inside, it didn't matter what you believed, only what they could get you to confess. They called it heresy, a fancy word for thinking differently, for remembering something they wanted forgotten, for reading a book that wasn't approved, or worse, for writing one. People were tortured, not because the church enjoyed pain, but because it wanted silence, it wanted obedience, it wanted memory to stay in line. The trials were never fair. You couldn't bring a lawyer. You didn't know who accused you. Sometimes you didn't even know what you were being accused of. And if they found you guilty, which they almost always did, you were punished, jailed, exiled, branded, or burned. This wasn't just about religion. It was about control. The Inquisition made sure everyone thought the same, spoke the same, believed the same, and anyone who stepped out of line became an example. Even powerful people weren't safe. Scientists like Galileo were forced to deny their discoveries. Writers had to bury their ideas in symbols and riddles. Some disappeared completely, leaving behind only rumours of the truths they tried to share. But the worst part wasn't the fire or the fear, it was the silence that followed. Families stopped talking about the past. Students stopped asking hard questions. People learned to forget things on purpose, just to survive. That's why this chapter is called the Inquisition of Memory. Because the real target wasn't the people, it was what they knew, what they might teach, what they might pass on. The church didn't just want power over the present, it wanted to rewrite the past and shape the future. And to do that, it had to erase anything that didn't fit its version of the truth. So the Inquisition became a weapon, not just of fire, but of forgetting. And centuries later, we are still feeling the effects. Whole pieces of history are missing. Whole ways of thinking were erased. And the question that still burns is this: what if the greatest crimes of the Inquisition weren't against people, but against memory itself? In stained glass windows and stone statues, they look so real. Saints with glowing halos, holding swords or lilies, standing tall above the crowds. Their names are etched in churches, and their stories told in every Sunday sermon. But what if some of them never existed at all? This is the secret side of sainthood. A world where stories were more powerful than truth, and where legends were crafted not by witnesses, but by writers in robes. In the early centuries of the church, becoming a saint was simple. You lived a holy life. You were remembered by those who knew you. Maybe you died for your faith. Over time, people began to pray in your name, and miracles were linked to your story. But as the church grew, sainthood became something else. A tool, a message, a way to control hearts, minds, and history. Some saints were created to fill gaps in the calendar, others to inspire loyalty in specific regions. Still, others were invented to replace pagan gods with Christian heroes. The church needed symbols people could rally around, and so it wrote them into existence. A woman who cured the sick with her touch. A soldier who never lost a battle because of his faith. A child who refused to deny Christ even under torture. These stories were dramatic, moving, and most importantly useful. But many of them came from no historical records, no graves, no birth certificates. Just stories passed down and polished until they felt real. Miracles were added to make the legends shine brighter. Visions of angels, statues that cried, bodies that never decayed. But when historians went looking centuries later, they often found nothing. No evidence, no origin, just a name, a story, and a church that swore it was true. And once someone was declared a saint, their story became untouchable. Questioning it was seen as doubting God himself. The church guarded these legends fiercely because they weren't just about faith. They were about power. Imagine a region where people were drifting away from the church. Suddenly, a new saint is discovered there. A local hero who saw visions, who performed miracles, who died a holy death. Pilgrims begin to visit. Donations pour in, a shrine is built, and just like that, the church has reclaimed its influence. That's the strategy behind some of the most beloved saints in history. They were crafted not because they lived, but because their stories served a purpose. And even today, their names remain. We celebrate their feast days, name schools after them, whisper prayers in their honour, all without ever knowing who they really were, or if they ever were. This isn't to say every saint is fake. Many lived real lives of courage and sacrifice, but woven among them are ghost stories, beautiful lies that became tradition. And if we don't question them, we end up worshipping not people, but stories written to keep us believing in the version of history someone else chose to tell. They called it the Dark Ages, a time when the world forgot how to think, when science stopped, when people lived in fear and superstition. But what if that darkness wasn't real? What if it was invented much later by people with a reason to rewrite the past? In the 19th century, something strange happened. Textbooks all across Europe started to describe the Middle Ages as a 1,000-year blackout, a time of ignorance, disease, and misery. And they blamed the church. They said faith had choked reason, that monks had locked away knowledge, that nothing good came out of that time except cathedrals and crusades. And people believed it, because when you're taught something in school over and over, you stop questioning it. It becomes fact. But the truth is more complicated and more suspicious. The term Dark Ages wasn't even used during the Middle Ages. People back then didn't see themselves as lost or broken. They built cities, preserved books, explored medicine and math. Sure, they had problems. Wars plague bad leaders, but every era does. So why did the 19th century suddenly paint them as the worst time in history? The answer lies in control. By the 1800s, Europe was changing fast. Science was rising. The church was losing influence. Nations were trying to separate religion from education. And to do that, they needed a villain. Something to blame for the years of silence and superstition. So they rewrote the past to make religion look like the enemy of progress. It worked. They made it seem like before the Renaissance, everyone was stuck in the mud, that nothing useful happened for 1,000 years. Once the church lost its grip, the world finally began to think again. It was a powerful story. And like most powerful stories, it wasn't completely true. What they didn't tell students was that monks had preserved ancient texts. Those cathedrals were marvels of engineering. Those universities were founded during those so-called dark times. That the stars were charted, medicine advanced, and ideas spread long before the Enlightenment. But those facts didn't fit the new narrative, so they were left out, and the invented darkness took hold. This campaign wasn't led by evil people. It was led by people with an agenda, people who wanted to move the world forward by breaking from the past. But in doing so, they didn't just attack the church. They erased the real complexity of 1,000 years of human life. And we still feel it today. Most people hear the Middle Ages and picture ignorant candles and plagues. They don't picture debating art inventions or thoughts. That's the power of a rewritten past. So the next time someone calls it the Dark Ages, ask who turned off the light. Because maybe it wasn't a time of darkness. Maybe it was a time that someone didn't want you to see clearly. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often think of a world stuck in ignorance, dirty streets chanting monks burning witches, and nobody knowing how to read. That picture didn't appear by accident. It was built, taught, repeated, until no one thought to question it. This is the myth of the medieval mind. A story that made the past look foolish, so the present could feel smarter. For over a century, schools across the world painted the Middle Ages as a dark and backward time. Textbooks described it as a 1,000-year nap between the fall of Rome and the birth of modern science. Teachers said people thought the earth was flat, that medicine was just prayers and bloodletting, that no one had original ideas. But if you actually look at the records, you'll find something very different. People in the Middle Ages studied the stars. They mapped the planets with careful notes and sharp tools. They experimented with herbs and surgery. They debated philosophy and logic in universities that still exist today. They copied and preserved texts that would have been lost forever if not for their work. So why does the myth survive? Because once a version of history gets printed in enough textbooks, it becomes invisible. You don't see it as a story, you see it as the truth. And the people shaping those textbooks in the 19th and 20th centuries had goals. They wanted to show how far we had come, how science had defeated superstition, how modern governments were better than old kings and popes. To do that, they needed the past to look worse. Not just different, worse. And it wasn't just in schools. Movies, books, and TV shows all reinforced the myth. Knights were shown as dumb brutes, villagers as terrified peasants, churchmen as power-hungry zealots. The whole age became a cartoon, a joke. But the real tragedy is not that we laughed. It's that we stopped listening. We stopped looking at what those people actually left behind. Because the medieval mind wasn't dumb. It was curious. I was careful. It asked questions that we still ask today about time, space, life, and death. Sure, they didn't have the tools we do now, but that doesn't mean they were blind. By erasing their intelligence, we made ourselves feel superior, and in doing so, we lost a part of our own story. Education should reveal the past, not hide it. The media should challenge myths, not repeat them. But for too long, both have told us that the Middle Ages were a joke. And that joke has shaped the way millions of people think about history. The truth is more powerful, more complex, and more useful. Because if we can understand the real minds of the past, we might finally begin to see how much of our present is still shaped by them, and how much of our history has been filtered through a lens someone else designed. They walked in silence, hoods over their heads, robes brushing the ground, eyes lowered in obedience. But these weren't just monks, they were collectors, hunters, seekers of something more valuable than gold: manuscripts. In the centuries after Rome's fall, the world changed. Libraries crumbled, empires vanished, and knowledge scattered like dust in the wind. But in the shadows the church was gathering. Not armies or land, but something more powerful: ideas. Monasteries across Europe began searching for old texts. Greek philosophy, Roman science, Persian astronomy, Egyptian medicine, anything that held fragments of the ancient world. And once they found it, they didn't share it. They stored it, copied it, buried it behind thick stone walls. It was called preservation, but it looked a lot like possession. The Vatican soon became the centre of this quiet operation. Deep beneath its halls, a vault was growing, a collection so secret that even now most people don't know what's in it. Thousands of manuscripts, some said to be the only copies left on Earth. Others are rumoured to contain ideas too dangerous for the outside world. And here's the strange part: many of these texts were never seen again. They were found copied once and then vanished. Scholars who once mentioned them in letters stopped talking. Historians looking for them found empty shelves. Whole sections of human history began to blur. Some believe the monks were just saving these works from war and weather, that without them the knowledge would have been lost. But others ask why so many of those manuscripts never made it back into public hands. Why were only certain parts copied? Why were whole subjects erased? What if it wasn't just about saving books? What if it was about controlling what people were allowed to remember? The monks didn't wear armour, but they were warriors in a different way. They fought with ink, with silence, with locked doors and whispered orders from Rome. They didn't need to burn libraries. They just had to make them disappear. And over time, they succeeded. Ancient cures, lost maps, forbidden gospels. Whole schools of thought were swallowed into a vault no one could enter. Even today, the Vatican Library holds secrets. It's not just old scrolls and dusty covers. It's the memory of a world that came before. A world that thought differently, prayed differently, maybe even understood time differently. But we'll never know for sure, because the monks who took everything didn't leave breadcrumbs. They left a trail of silence. And that silence shaped the world we live in now. Imagine what's still hidden. Imagine what's still locked away. And ask yourself, what kind of truth would make them hide it for over 1,000 years? There once was a list so powerful that entire books vanished just by being on it. A list that didn't just decide what people could read, but what they could think, what they could question, what they were allowed to imagine. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. For over 400 years, the Vatican kept it updated, a growing record of ideas they wanted buried, titles burned or locked away, authors silenced. And readers warned that touching these pages might not just damage their faith, but cost them their souls. At first it sounds extreme. But the church believed ideas were dangerous. Those words could plant seeds that bloomed into doubt and rebellion. So they built a firewall, a list of what not to read. And for many people, that list became law. It wasn't just witchcraft or heresy. The index banned science, history, philosophy, even poetry, anything that questioned doctrine, anything that painted the church in a bad light, anything that suggested another truth. Copernicus was on it, Galileo too. Books that said the earth moved, books that claimed other worlds might exist, even medical texts that contradicted religious teachings, all labelled forbidden. And this wasn't just about protecting belief, it was about protecting power. Because once you start thinking for yourself, you might start asking the wrong questions. What if the Bible was misinterpreted? What if saints never lived? What if time itself had been manipulated? To prevent those questions, the church created a system of control. Censors read every book before it could be published. Monks crossed out sentences that strayed too far. Authors were forced to rewrite or recant, and if they refused, they were punished. Some were excommunicated, others were imprisoned, some disappeared entirely. But even as the list grew, so did curiosity. People whispered about the banned titles, passed copies in secret, smuggled them across borders, because deep down people always want to know what they're not supposed to. The index didn't just shape what people read, it shaped what was remembered, what made it into libraries, classrooms, museums, what survived history at all. And when the church finally ended the index in 1966, the damage was already done. Centuries of silence, whole ideas erased before they had a chance to grow, all in the name of protecting truth. But here's the thing, truth doesn't need protection, it needs light, debate, openness. The index taught people to fear ideas, to burn books instead of reading them, to shut their minds and follow orders. And that fear still echoes today. So, next time you pick up a book, remember how many others were taken from hands just like yours. Banned not because they were wrong, but because they made someone in power feel afraid. There is a place in the heart of the Vatican that almost no one has seen. A vault buried under layers of stone gates, guards, and silence. It holds over 50 miles of shelves, and some say more secrets than any government on earth. They call it the Vatican Secret Archive, but its real name might as well be the Memory Vault of History. The archive is not just a room, it's a fortress. Hidden behind locked doors and heavy walls, it contains documents going back over 1,000 years. Letters from kings and emperors, trials of heretics, banned manuscripts, lost maps, even rumours of books that were erased from every other library on the planet. But here's the strange part. You can't just walk in, you can't browse or explore. You can't even see the full catalogue of what's there. Only a handful of scholars are granted access. And even then, they're only allowed to request specific documents. Not topics, not subjects, specific names, dates, titles. And if the Vatican says no, there is no appeal, no explanation, just a polite silence. That silence has lasted for centuries. So what is being hidden? Some say it's just old paperwork. The church records papal letters and birth certificates, but others believe the archive holds something much deeper. Lost Gospels that were never included in the Bible, ancient texts from destroyed temples, proof that timelines were changed, or worse, that entire histories were invented. Imagine a document showing the church moved the date of Easter to align with a pagan festival, or a scroll proving that a saint was created to replace a Roman goddess, or a letter revealing that the Inquisition targeted not heretics but scientists. We're not just talking about dusty books, we're talking about control. The archive is not a museum, it is a gatekeeper, and the very idea that this knowledge is locked away while the world debates what's true and what's not is chilling. In 2019, the Church tried to quiet the rumours. They renamed the archive to make it sound less mysterious. They said the word secret just meant private. But that doesn't change the fact that access is still restricted. That even popes have admitted not everything inside has been read. Think about that. A vault so vast and so ancient that even its own keepers don't know everything that's inside. What if the real reason for the secrecy isn't to protect the past, but to protect the present from what the past might reveal? Because once you open that door, you can't control what comes out. And maybe that's what the Vatican fears most. Not blasphemy, not heresy, but memory. Real memory. The kind that can't be rewritten or silenced. The kind that reminds us that history was never lost. It was just locked away. Somewhere in a drawer behind a locked Vatican door, there might be a map that could rewrite everything we think we know about history. Not a fantasy map with dragons and sea monsters, but a real one, drawn centuries ago, showing places that shouldn't exist, at least not according to what we've been taught. One of the most famous examples is the Piri-Reis map. Created in 1513 by a Turkish admiral, it somehow shows parts of the world that Europeans hadn't even discovered yet. What's even stranger is that it outlines the coast of Antarctica, not as a frozen wasteland, but with rivers, mountains, and greenery. This was centuries before we had satellites. Before Antarctica was even officially discovered. How could that be possible? The Piri-Reis map wasn't made from scratch. It was pieced together from even older charts. Some that may have come from the Library of Alexandria. Others from lost civilizations we no longer remember. And that's just one example. There are dozens of maps like it, hidden in private collections, museum, basements, and yes, maybe even the Vatican. Now imagine what maps the Vatican has that no one has seen. Maps that show trade routes that disappeared, islands that don't exist anymore, or civilizations that never made it into our textbooks. Only a tiny fraction of historical maps are ever made public. Most are kept locked away and studied by a handful of scholars who rarely share what they find. And even when something does get released, it's usually a cleaned up version, the 1% they want you to see. So what's in the 99%? What could we learn if those maps were open to the world? Maybe we'd find that history is more connected than we thought. Those people were sailing across oceans long before Columbus. That ancient cultures were trading ideas across continents. That timelines are off by centuries. Or maybe we'd discover that some parts of the world were mapped not by man, but by something else entirely. And it's not just the maps themselves, it's what's written in the margins, strange symbols, lost languages, notes that suggest the mapmakers knew more than they should have, warnings, directions, secrets. If knowledge is power, then maps are the ultimate weapon. They tell you where to go, what to avoid, and what lies just beyond the horizon. And whoever controls the maps controls the narrative. The Church understood that. The Vatican knew the importance of geography in shaping theology, in protecting relics, and in maintaining its place at the centre of the world. So they collected, preserved, and quietly edited. And today, most people don't even realise how much has been erased, or how much still waits behind those vault doors. So next time you see a globe, or open a history book, ask yourself, is this the world as it was? or just the version someone chose to let us see. There was a time when asking how the stars moved could get you exiled. Treating a fever with herbs instead of prayer could be seen as witchcraft. When suggesting that Earth wasn't the center of the universe wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. In that world, science wasn't a path to truth. It was a sin. The church didn't always start that way. At first, monks copied old scientific texts. Some even experimented with early medicine and astronomy. But as the church's power grew, so did its fear of anything it couldn't control. And science was messy. It asked questions that didn't always fit with scripture. It searched for answers beyond miracles. It threatened to make humans the authors of knowledge instead of just followers of divine will. So slowly and carefully science was caged. Astronomers who studied the skies were told to stop looking. The stars belonged to God. The heavens were fixed, perfect, eternal. Anyone who said otherwise was challenging creation itself. Galileo learned this the hard way. When he said Earth moved around the sun, he wasn't just making a new model. He was challenging the very foundation of the church's teaching. And for that he was forced to kneel and deny what he knew was true. It wasn't just astronomy. Medicine faced the same wall. Dissecting a human body to understand how it worked was called sinful. Studying the heart or the brain without permission could brand you a heretic. Instead, people were told to pray, to confess, to suffer. Disease was seen as punishment, not biology. Healing was supposed to come from above, not from science. Even physics, the study of how the world moves and works, was seen as suspicious. Gravity, motion, force. These were not just theories, they were threats, because they replaced mystery with math. And mystery was part of the church's grip. The fear was not just about ideas, it was about control. If people stopped needing the church for answers, they might stop needing it altogether. If they trusted a scientist more than a priest, what would that mean for faith, authority, salvation? So the church did what it knew best. It was censored, it silenced, it was rewritten. And for centuries, the brightest minds had to work in secret or risk being destroyed. Some were burned, others were erased. Some simply vanished from history. But science never died, it just hid. It whispered in books passed from hand to hand. It flickered in candle-lit corners of monasteries. It survived not because it was allowed, but because it was needed. And when the walls finally cracked, and science came rushing back into the open, the world changed forever. But we should never forget how long it was kept in chains, and who held the keys. There was a time when looking up at the stars could get you killed. Not because the stars were dangerous, but because of what they revealed. For centuries, the heavens were supposed to be perfectly fixed and divine. The church had placed Earth at the center of the universe and said God had designed it that way. So when a few brave astronomers started to say otherwise, everything began to shake. Giordano Bruno was one of the first. He wasn't just an astronomer, he was a philosopher, a thinker, and a questioner. He believed the universe was infinite. Those stars were other suns with their own planets, that maybe even those planets had life. He said Earth was not the center. It was just one small world among many. And that idea terrified the church. Because if Earth wasn't special, what did that mean for everything else? For the Bible? For creation? For the story the church had been telling? Bruno's ideas were labelled heresy. He was arrested, tortured, and eventually burned alive in a public square. Not for violence, not for crimes, but for thinking too much about the stars. Then came Galileo. He built a telescope and pointed it at the sky. What he saw changed everything. moons circling Jupiter, mountains on the moon, phases of Venus. Proof that not everything revolved around Earth. Galileo didn't try to start a war. He was a man of faith. But he believed truth mattered more than tradition. When he published his findings, the church was furious. He was called to Rome and forced to stand before the Inquisition. They demanded he say he was wrong, that the earth stood still, that the sun revolved around us. And in the end, to avoid Bruno's fate, Galileo knelt and recanted. But legend says, as he stood up, he whispered under his breath, "And yet it moves." That quiet sentence became a symbol for all those who had been silenced before and after him. Astronomers who dared to look beyond dogma. Scientists who chose the stars over safety. Minds that reached for truth, knowing it could cost them everything. The church feared the telescope not because of what it showed, but because of what it meant. That humans could understand the cosmos without a priest. That the universe might be bigger, stranger, older than anyone had dared imagine. And that fear led to one of the longest battles between science and religion in history. But the truth never stays buried. Galileo was eventually proven right. Bruno's ideas became mainstream. The stars kept moving, and so did the minds of those brave enough to follow them. Still, the memory of those who were silenced lingers. Because for every Galileo who survived, there were dozens who didn't. And the sky they studied still holds the echoes of questions they were never allowed to ask. There are stories in old texts that sound like magic. Machines that moved without animals. Lights that burned without fire. Voices heard from metal tubes. Doors that opened by themselves. To modern ears, they sound like science fiction. But what if they were something else? What if they were real? Long before the church took control of knowledge, there were civilizations building strange and powerful things. In ancient Greece, there was a man named Hero of Alexandria. He built steam-powered devices. One of them looked like a spinning ball that moved using hot air pressure. It was the first known engine, over 1,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. But what happened to that knowledge? Why didn't the world leap forward with inventions instead of waiting centuries? The answer might be as simple as this. The miracles were easier to control than the machines. As the church rose to power, it began rewriting how people understood the past. Stories of lost technologies were turned into legends, myths, miracles, things only saints or prophets could do. And in doing that, the church didn't just erase the invention, it erased the inventor. If a machine could move water, it was called divine. If a device could predict stars, it was described as angelic. But no one asked how, because to ask was to doubt, and to doubt was dangerous. Even the Ark of the Covenant has been theorized by some researchers to be more than just a holy box. Some believe it may have been a kind of electrical device, covered in gold, surrounded by specific instructions. So powerful that anyone who touched it the wrong way died instantly. Miracle or misunderstood machine? There are old maps showing flight paths, statues holding what look like ancient batteries, texts that describe metal birds flying through the sky. But instead of being studied as science, these were locked away as heresy or explained away as symbols. Because if people realize the ancients had technology maybe even more advanced than what came after, it would break the timeline. It would ruin the idea of constant upward progress. It would raise questions the church wasn't prepared to answer. Like, who really built these things? And why did they disappear? Some say the knowledge was lost during war. Others believe it was hidden on purpose, stored in the Vatican's vaults, or destroyed to protect the illusion of divine miracles. Because when you replace machines with magic, it gives power to the storytellers, to those who decide what is fact and what is just holy mystery. But the world is waking up. People are asking questions, looking at old texts with new eyes, wondering if the wonders of the past were less about faith and more about forgotten science. And if that's true, then maybe the biggest miracle is how well they managed to hide it. What if I told you we might be living in the wrong year, not just by a few days or months, but by centuries? That the calendar you see every day might be built on a lie? It sounds impossible. But some historians believe that nearly 300 years of history never actually happened. They call it the phantom time hypothesis. The idea is wild. It says that somewhere between the years 600 and 1000 AD, a chunk of time was added to the calendar. Not lived, just invented. Think about that. It would mean that the year we call 2025 might really be closer to 1725, and that Charlemagne, the famous emperor who shaped Europe, never existed at all. So how could something like this even happen? It starts with the Holy Roman Empire, a time of chaos, confusion, and collapsing record-keeping. When Pope Sylvester II and Emperor Otto III were in power, it's believed they wanted to live in the year 1000. A big, round, holy number, but they were too early. So instead of waiting, they may have changed the calendar to make it happen. Old texts were rewritten. Kings were given new timelines. Battles were moved. Years were stretched or doubled. And with so many people unable to read or track time themselves, no one noticed. But it gets stranger. There's very little physical evidence from those missing centuries. Hardly any buildings. A few coins. No confirmed graves of major figures. The records that do exist are often copies of copies made much later. Almost like someone was trying to fill in a blank spot that shouldn't have been there. Even our dating system, called Anno Domini, was pushed into place during this strange period. Before that, people measured time differently. Suddenly, everything snapped to one timeline, one version of events. And the church was in charge of keeping that version alive. If the phantom time hypothesis is true, it means our history books are partly fiction, that we believe in centuries of stories that may have been crafted to give the church more power, to create an illusion of divine order, a false age of darkness, followed by a holy rebirth. And if you think this is just a fringe idea, even modern scholars admit the early medieval period is murky, confusing, filled with gaps and contradictions. Why would anyone do this? Because time is controlled. If you decide what year it is, you shape what came before and what's expected after. You control prophecy. You control destiny. And you erase the memory of anything that doesn't fit your story. So maybe we should be asking, what else was deleted when they rewrote the clock? And if the past can be edited that easily, how do we ever know what time it really is? There's something strange hiding in the official list of popes. A line that's supposed to stretch back more than 2,000 years without interruption, each name flowing neatly into the next. But what if some of those names never belonged to real people? What if entire popes were invented to cover up a hole in time? That's the heart of one of the weirdest questions in church history. And it starts with the missing years. The same ones from the phantom time hypothesis. Around 600 to 900 AD, the timeline gets blurry. Wars were everywhere. Communication was collapsing. Records were lost. And yet somehow, the Vatican has a perfect list of popes. No gaps, no confusion, just name after name, as if nothing happened. That doesn't make sense. We're told the Dark Ages were full of chaos and destruction, plagues, invasions, illiteracy. And yet, the Vatican managed to maintain a crystal clear record of leadership, even when the rest of Europe was forgetting how to write its own history. That's not just suspicious, it's impossible. Take a closer look at some of the names from this period. Many have almost no records outside church documents. No coins, no inscriptions, no letters. It's like they existed only in writing. And not the kind that was passed around, the kind that was locked away in one place. There are stories of anti-popes too, men who claimed the papacy in secret, or were placed in power during political games. Some were later erased or replaced in official records. Others were renamed to keep the timeline neat. It's almost like the church was editing history as it went. Imagine needing to create a smooth story, one that shows the church always in control, always blessed, always connected to Peter and the beginning of the faith. You couldn't admit that there were decades with no pope, or that no one knew who was in charge. So maybe you just filled in the blanks. A name here, a miracle there, a few made-up acts of holiness to make it stick. And just like that, the gap was gone. We do know for a fact that some early church records were forged. Entire documents were created centuries after the events they describe. Papal decrees, letters, even some church councils, all shaped to give the Vatican more authority over time. So if they faked documents, could they have faked popes too? It's not about blaming anyone alive today. It's about questioning the story we've been handed. A story that paints the church as an unbroken pillar of truth even during the world's darkest days. But history is rarely perfect. And when you find something that clean, in a time that messy, it usually means someone took out the eraser. And the question becomes, who were they trying to protect? And what were they trying to hide? Not all saints were born from miracles. Some were born from silence, from empty spaces in time where something was missing. And instead of admitting there was nothing there, the church gave us someone to worship. A name, a story, a symbol of faith, even if the person never actually existed. These weren't just random figures made holy. They were carefully placed, like puzzle pieces dropped into the timeline to make it feel whole. Historians call it narrative filling, but in this case, the narrative wasn't just a book. It was the history of the entire Western world. Imagine you're living in the 8th or 9th century. Records are scarce. Stories are passed by word of mouth. Entire decades might disappear without a single event written down. But the church needs its timeline to look perfect. So it starts inserting saints. Each one has a purpose, a miracle performed, a city protected, a heresy defeated. But when scholars look deeper, the dates don't line up. The events never happened. The towns didn't exist yet. And the relics they supposedly left behind appear centuries after their supposed deaths. One example is Saint Philomena. Her story was discovered in the 1800s. A tomb was found. The name Philomena was painted on the wall. No one knew who she was. But that didn't stop the church. A full backstory was written. She became a virgin martyr, a miracle worker. She was canonized. Prayers were written. Statues built. But over time, the story fell apart. There was no real evidence she ever lived. She's not the only one. There are dozens of saints with biographies written long after their supposed lives. Stories filled with divine visions, dragons, and battles against evil. Perfect for inspiring faith. but empty when it comes to actual history. Some saints seem to have been modelled on older pagan gods. Their traits were repurposed, their holidays have been converted, their symbols are reused. It was a way to transition people into Christianity without wiping out their traditions. Replace a god with a saint, and the rituals could stay. But other saints were more than replacements. They were fillers, created to explain a church's origin, to justify a pilgrimage site, to give meaning to a time when no one knew what had really happened. And by placing these saints into the timeline, the church didn't just erase the silence, it made it sacred. The problem isn't that these figures inspired people, it's that they blurred the line between history and fiction, between devotion and design. And once those lines are blurred, it becomes nearly impossible to tell what was real and what was written. So the next time you hear the story of a saint who performed a miracle in a time when nothing else was recorded, ask yourself, was this a memory or a placeholder, a name given to the silence, so no one would ask what used to be there? For most of history, human progress moved like molasses. For centuries, nothing seemed to change. People farmed the same way, lived the same way, prayed the same way. Then suddenly, in a flash, everything exploded. Science, technology, discovery, all at once. But why did it take so long? Some say it was just timing, that humanity needed to mature. But what if the truth is darker? What if knowledge was never missing, just delayed, on purpose? There are clues everywhere. Ancient Greeks knew about heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun, long before it was accepted. The Romans built roads, aqueducts, and concrete we still can't fully replicate. Old Chinese texts describe advanced medicine. Indian mathematicians understood concepts we credit to the Renaissance. So, what happened in between? The answer might lie in who had the keys. As the Roman Empire crumbled and chaos swept across Europe, one institution rose and took power: the Church. It didn't just save knowledge, it claimed it, locked it up in monasteries, rewrote it to fit theology, and decided who was allowed to learn and when. For the average person, books were gone, libraries burned, language shifted, only Latin remained, and only the clergy could read it. Ideas that had once been shared freely were now behind walls, behind robes, behind silence. Imagine 1,000 years where questions were dangerous, where theories could get you exiled or worse, where innovation wasn't encouraged, it was feared, because new ideas meant new thoughts, and new thoughts meant people might stop listening to the church. It wasn't just about faith, it was about control. Even in the Renaissance, the so-called rebirth of knowledge feels suspicious. Suddenly, old texts reappear, forgotten inventions resurface. Artists and thinkers are celebrated for rediscovering what had already been known centuries earlier. Rediscovered or released, because the church was at the centre of that too, deciding which texts could be copied, which thinkers could speak, which discoveries were safe enough to share. It's like someone opened the floodgates just a little, let enough knowledge out to dazzle the world, but not enough to break the system. And those who went too far paid the price. Scientists, philosophers, astronomers, anyone who challenged the story was silenced, or forced to recant, or erased from the timeline altogether. So maybe the question isn't why it took so long for breakthroughs to happen. Maybe the real question is, who was holding them back? Because when one group controls the past, they also control the future. And if you can delay knowledge just long enough, you can rewrite the world before anyone even realizes what they lost. Time seems simple. You check your watch, you mark your calendar, you celebrate a birthday. But behind all of that is a question nobody asks. Who decided what time it is? Because once you control the clock, you control everything. You decide when the year begins, when it ends, what happened when, who came first, who gets remembered, and who quietly disappears. The church figured this out early. After the fall of Rome, someone needed to organize time again. Seasons were shifting, festivals were out of sync, so they built a new calendar, one that started not with a king or an empire, but with a birth, the birth of Christ. Suddenly, all of history was split in two, before and after, BC and AD. It wasn't just a way to track dates, it was a statement. Time itself now serves theology. And if you think that's just clever branding, it gets deeper. The church didn't just name the years. They chose which years to keep, which ones to erase, which ones to double, and what to call it all. They made entire centuries vanish, or added centuries that might never have happened. Time became something you could edit. Wars were moved, kings were shuffled, saints were placed exactly where they were needed. Whole periods were labelled dark just because they didn't fit the story, and through it all, the clock kept ticking. But only because someone was winding it from behind the scenes. Even the Gregorian calendar, the one we use now, was created by a pope, Pope Gregory XIII. He added leap years, shifted days, and brought the world in line with a new sense of divine order. It wasn't just a fix, it was a reset. And here's where it gets scary. Because once people believe the clock is true, you can do anything. Want to erase a heretic, move his birth date, say he lived at the wrong time, claim he never existed. Want to boost a legend? Give him a miracle date, place it on a holy feast. Rewrite history to fit the rhythm you've created. Time became a weapon, a silent one. No need for swords or fire, just ink, just dates. Just enough adjustments to shape the world's memory. Today, we think we're free of that. That time is just numbers on a phone. But our entire understanding of history, science, religion, and even identity is built on a timeline someone else made. So ask yourself, what if that clock was wrong? What if the years we trust were planted like seeds? And the harvest is what we call history. Then maybe the most powerful person is not the one who rules the land, but the one who holds the clock and decides when the story begins. While the church worked to control what the world could see, and remember, there were others moving in the shadows, quietly passing knowledge hand to hand, hiding books in cellars, whispering truths in symbols and code. These were the secret societies. And they didn't follow the church's version of history. They had their own. The most well-known were the Freemasons. They didn't start as a secret cult. They began as actual builders, stoneworkers, architects. But somewhere along the line, their lodges stopped being about construction and started being about protection, not of people, but of ideas. The Masons believed in something dangerous. That truth belongs to everyone. That knowledge should be shared, not locked away. They used signs and rituals, not for mystery, but for survival, to hide in plain sight, because speaking openly could get you tried for heresy, or worse. Then there were the Rosicrucians, a group so secret some historians still argue if they ever really existed. They claim to follow ancient wisdom from Egypt, Greece, and Babylon, not the version the church approved, but the raw, unfiltered kind: astronomy, alchemy, medicine. They believed the world had been tricked into forgetting what it once knew, and their mission was to remember. These groups didn't trust official timelines. They didn't believe history was written fairly, so they kept their own records, passed down through generations. Sometimes hidden in paintings, sometimes buried under cathedrals, sometimes encoded in music or poetry. Because when truth is dangerous, you don't write it in plain language. You protect it like treasure. The church knew they were out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes they tried to destroy them, accused them of witchcraft, labelled them pagans, burned what they could find. But the secret societies had already learned how to disappear. And yet, even in silence, they still left clues. A strange carving on a cathedral wall, a map with stars that don't match the sky, a symbol on an old manuscript that no one can explain. To the average person, these things mean nothing, but to those who know what to look for, it's a message. A reminder that history has more than one version. It makes you wonder how much truth survived only because someone broke the rules, because a group of people decided to remember when the rest of the world was told to forget. So next time you hear about secret societies, don't picture cloaks and torches. Picture a quiet rebellion. Picture knowledge slipping through cracks. Picture men and women who knew the cost of truth but protected it anyway. Because while the church built walls, they built tunnels underneath. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never made it into the official script. When you walk through an old cathedral, you might see angels carved in stone, crosses in stained glass, or saints painted on ceilings. But if you look closer, you might find something strange. A shape that doesn't belong, a symbol that feels older than the building itself. Something hidden in plain sight. That's not decoration, that's a message. For centuries, when open speech could get you killed, people turned to symbols. A spiral etched in a corner, a hand sign in a painting, a pattern built into a floor. These weren't random. They were part of a language, a way to speak without words, to pass ideas beneath the surface while pretending to stay silent. The church controlled the words, but it didn't always notice the images. Secret societies like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians used symbols like this to pass messages. So did artists and architects who weren't allowed to say what they really believed. A triangle might mean balance. A rose might stand for truth. A certain angle in a building might match the stars on a day the church wanted everyone to forget. Even numbers became sacred. 3s and 7s, 12 windows, 13 steps. Some thought they reflected divine order. Others saw them as codes for ancient systems hidden by time. Either way, they were not accidental. In some cathedrals, you'll find carvings of creatures that don't appear in any Bible. Winged beasts, half-human hybrids. Some of them come from much older stories, myths that predate Christianity, myths the church tried to bury, but they live on in stone because someone remembered. Underground churches, especially in places like France or Turkey, are full of these hidden messages. Carved labyrinths, eye symbols, stars aligned with solstice points. They were built to reflect something deeper than just worship. They were maps of the forgotten. And then there are the buildings themselves, entire structures shaped like prayers or puzzles. Cathedrals with geometry so precise it follows sacred ratios from ancient times. Ratios that reflect music, math, and astronomy. Knowledge that wasn't supposed to survive the dark, but it did. Because of symbols, people learned to see without being told. They taught their children what to notice. A certain pattern meant this story was true. A certain colour meant it had been censored. A certain statue meant there was a book buried underneath. This wasn't rebellion with swords, it was rebellion with chisels and brushes. And even today, some of these codes are still unsolved. Messages frozen in architecture, just waiting for the right eyes to see them. So next time you walk past a stained glass window or a statue in a forgotten courtyard, remember, you might be looking at a message from the past, left by someone who wasn't allowed to speak, but still had something the world needed to hear. Not every monk burned books. Some saved them, quietly, carefully, hidden beneath stone floors or behind walls lined with scripture. In a time when questions were forbidden and doubt could be deadly, a few hands chose to protect ideas instead of erase them. Imagine a candlelit cell deep in a cold monastery. A robed figure hunched over parchment, not copying a Bible, but a banned scroll. A Greek text, an Egyptian formula, a forgotten map. He listens for footsteps, hides his work the moment someone knocks. He knows if he's caught, it could mean exile, or worse, but he writes anyway, because some knowledge is too important to lose. We often talk about what the church destroyed, but we rarely ask what it almost destroyed, what only barely survived because a few people took a risk. Some of the most brilliant works of the ancient world only exist today because of secret scribes. The writings of Plato, the medical theories of Galen, the astronomy of Ptolemy, the math of Archimedes. All of it could have vanished if someone hadn't tucked it away. Why would monks save texts the church declared dangerous? Because not all of them agreed with the rules. Some believed that faith and knowledge could live side by side. Others knew that once something is erased, it's almost impossible to bring back. They saw fires lit in other cities, libraries turned to ash, and they decided not to let it happen again. But the preservation came with a price. Some texts were hidden for so long that by the time they were found centuries later, the world had already moved on. Discoveries that could have changed everything were too late to matter. Others were rewritten so many times their original meaning was blurred, twisted just enough to pass inspection. The truth is still there, but buried. Then there were texts that were saved for the wrong reasons, not to protect knowledge, but to control it. Locked in vaults, copied but never shared, studied in secret circles but kept from the public. A different kind of silence, one that hoards instead of destroys. And even today, some of these writings are rumoured to exist in the Vatican's deepest archives. Scrolls that describe lost civilizations, manuscripts that hint at forgotten sciences, pages written in languages we still haven't translated, not because we can't, but because we were never supposed to. So when people say the church killed knowledge, they're only telling half the story. The other half is this. Some knowledge didn't die. It went underground. It survived in the shadows, in whispered prayers and ink-stained hands, waiting for a time when it could speak again. And maybe that time is now, because the past was never completely lost. It was just hiding. And someone out there, I had the courage to keep the candle burning. We're told the Renaissance was a miracle, a sudden explosion of art science and human brilliance after centuries of darkness. One moment, the world was stuck in the mud. The next, it was painting like Da Vinci, sculpting like Michelangelo, and solving the mysteries of the stars. But what if it wasn't sudden at all? What if the knowledge never really vanished? What if it was just kept on a shelf and taken down when the time was right? The word Renaissance means rebirth. But how do you rebirth something unless it had already lived and died? That's the trick. Much of what we credit to the Renaissance was not new, it was old, ancient. Greek texts, Roman techniques, Eastern ideas, all rediscovered, all revealed, as if by magic. But was it magic, or was it management? Imagine this. For centuries, the church has controlled what people know. Books are burned, languages are restricted, questions are silenced. But behind monastery walls and inside private libraries, certain texts are preserved, copied, translated in secret, not to be shared, but to be saved for later. Then something changes. Maybe politics, maybe power. Maybe the world simply gets too curious. And instead of fighting that curiosity, the church decides to guide it, to release knowledge little by little. Let people think they're discovering it. Let them feel like heroes, but only give them what has already been filtered, already been approved. It's like feeding truth through a funnel. Not too fast, not too much, just enough to create wonder without causing rebellion. Take Copernicus. His theory about the sun being the centre of the universe was radical, but he wasn't the first to say it. Ancient astronomers had proposed it long before. Same with anatomy, medicine, architecture, all ideas reborn with new names, new champions, but ancient roots. And who decided which ideas to bring back? Who controlled the scrolls, the manuscripts, and the maps? It wasn't random, it was curated. Even the artists played a role. They painted scenes of myth and history that mirrored stories much older than the Bible. They blended Christian symbols with pagan ones. They carved hidden meanings into statues. Some did it knowingly, others may not. But the result was a wave of beauty and genius that seemed fresh, even though much of it came from a buried past. This wasn't a rediscovery, it was a reveal, timed, framed, directed, like a play, and the church stayed centre stage. It supported artists, funded libraries, encouraged science, but only when it aligned with doctrine. It allowed the light back in, just enough to chase away the shadows, but not enough to blind the audience with truth. So maybe the Renaissance wasn't the beginning of progress. Maybe it was a carefully managed illusion, a restart button for a story that had already been told, and maybe the real genius of the age wasn't the art or the science, but the way the past was dressed up and handed back to the world like a gift that had been waiting all along. In most stories, school is where you go to learn the truth, to understand the world, to ask questions. But in the world, the church-built education was not about truth, it was about control. Not teaching children what was real, but training them to forget what once was. From the moment kids could read, they were handed one version of history. A version where the church was always right, where saints were heroes, where ancient gods were lies, where curiosity was a sin and obedience was holy. And it worked. Because if you teach a child the same thing every day, they don't question it. They believe it. The church understood something powerful. Whoever teaches the children shapes the future. So they built schools inside monasteries. They trained priests to be teachers. They made Latin the language of learning, so only the elite could understand. They controlled the textbooks, the lessons, even the stories told at night. Imagine growing up in a world where the only maps you see show Europe at the centre, where the only science you hear comes from scripture, where every question ends with "because God said so." It doesn't matter what the past once held. If no one remembers it, it may as well have never happened. And if a student dared to ask about something different, they were warned, sometimes punished. Because in this system, curiosity wasn't a gift, it was dangerous. Ancient philosophies were erased. Pagan myths turned into demons. Historical timelines were trimmed and edited, and the teachers made sure no one noticed. They repeated the lies so often they became memories, not just for one person, but for entire generations. Even art became a tool. Paintings in classrooms showed biblical scenes. Statues in town squares told the same morals again and again. And music sung during lessons wasn't just for fun. It was a chant, a rhythm to drill belief into the bones. This wasn't just education, it was memory engineering. By the time students grew up, they weren't just followers. They were defenders of the version of truth they had been fed. They passed it to their children, who passed it to theirs, until no one even knew what had been lost. Some monasteries even kept real history locked away in private collections, hidden from the classrooms, protected but not shared, as if they knew the truth was valuable but too dangerous to teach. And today, when we look back and wonder how so much knowledge vanished, the answer might be simple. It didn't. It was overwritten, erased in lesson plans and prayers, buried under centuries of schooling that told only half the story. So, if you've ever felt like something about history doesn't add up, like there are missing pieces that no one wants to talk about, you're not wrong, because sometimes the deepest kind of forgetting is the kind that starts with a teacher and ends with silence. When you picture the Middle Ages, what do you see? A muddy village, a bearded king on a crooked throne, screaming peasants, burning witches, priests in shadowy robes whispering in Latin. Maybe even a knight swinging a sword while everyone around him lives in fear and filth. That image didn't come from textbooks, it came from movies. Cinema took the myth of darkness and turned it into a blockbuster. Directors dressed the past in grey. They made the skies always cloudy. The music is always creepy. They gave us stories of ignorance, fear, and superstition. And almost always the church stood in the centre, controlling everything. It worked because it looked real, but it wasn't. The truth is, the Middle Ages were not just one long nightmare. There was beauty, colour, music, invention, trade routes stretching from Africa to Asia, philosophers writing in Baghdad, scientists translate ancient Greek in Spain, but you won't see that in most films, because that version doesn't sell, the myth does. Hollywood loves a simple story, and nothing is simpler than light versus dark. The Renaissance was light, the church was dark. The Middle Ages were the darkness swallowing everything in between. And over time, the audience believed it. Think about how many movies show books being burned, how many show monks as creepy or cruel, how often a village elder says, "We don't question that here," and everyone nods in fear. These are patterns, storytelling choices, and they shape how we think. Even fantasy films echo this. Castles are cold, magic is evil, the wise man is silenced, the hero must rediscover what was lost. These stories don't just entertain, they train us to feel like the past was broken, and that nothing good survived unless someone from the future saved it. And here's the twist. A lot of those stories were based on propaganda. Stories the church helped write centuries ago to frame the timeline just right, to hide the gaps, to explain away the missing years. And later when filmmakers picked them up, they didn't ask questions. They just copied the script. But not all directors followed the rules. Some slipped in real symbols, hints of forgotten truths, a line of dialogue that didn't quite fit, a name that came from a banned book. Because cinema isn't just a weapon, It can also be a warning, and once in a while, a filmmaker tries to tell the truth beneath the lie. The problem is, those films rarely go viral. So if you grew up thinking the past was all plague pits and torch mobs, you're not alone. That image was designed, framed, lit just right, and sold as history. But maybe the real darkness isn't in the story. Maybe it's in the projector, blinding us with shadows, while the truth sits quietly, just off screen. Somewhere beneath Vatican City, there is a door. It doesn't look like much, just wood and iron. But behind it is one of the most secret places on Earth. A vault so large and old that even the people who guard it don't know everything it holds. They call it the Vatican Apostolic Archive. But most people know it by another name, the place where the truth went to disappear. For centuries, this vault has been locked to the outside world. Only a tiny group of trusted scholars can enter. And even then they are told what they can see. What folder, what page, what year. Everything else remains sealed. Quiet, untouched. So the real question is not what's in the archive. It's what isn't allowed out. Imagine walking into a hallway of pure silence. 1,000 years of dust floating through the light. Scrolls stacked in silence. Letters never opened. Manuscripts written by hands, long forgotten. Not fiction. No guesses, but records, eyewitness accounts. Original writings that could rewrite everything we think we know. What if there's a map in there showing continents before we said they were discovered? What if there's a diary written by someone who lived through the missing years? What if there's a gospel that didn't make the cut but tells a different story about who we are and where we came from? The church says the archive is there to preserve history. But history that no one can read is just a secret in a fancy box. Why hide it? Maybe because some truths are too dangerous. Maybe because opening one scroll could cause 1,000 questions. Or maybe the real power isn't in hiding lies, it's in hiding facts. There are whispers that some of the oldest documents in the archive don't come from Europe at all, that they were taken from ancient libraries before they burned, that some are written in languages we can't fully translate, that some might even describe technology we think was invented centuries later. Machines, measurements, maps of the stars. And maybe, most chilling of all are the letters. Personal notes from popes to kings. From priests to secret societies. Pages that talk about time shifts, missing records, forbidden rituals. Entire timelines erased by agreement. If even one of those letters is real, then the world outside the vault is living in a carefully edited version of reality. But here's the thing about vaults. They don't last forever. Locks rust, keys go missing, and sometimes someone talks. Maybe one day a page will leak, a document will surface, a truth will get out. And when it does, the whole timeline might crack. Because behind that vault door is not just light, it's the kind of light that blinds, that burns through lies, that forces the world to ask, what else have we been told to forget? And what happens if we finally remember? The stars don't lie. They move with precision like gears in a clock that's older than any kingdom or empire. Eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments all follow patterns that can be predicted thousands of years in advance, and that's exactly the problem. Because when historians tried to line up the timeline of human history with the timeline of the sky, something didn't add up. Imagine looking at a record from the year 800. It says an eclipse happened on a certain day, but when astronomers run the math, the eclipse doesn't match. It should have been visible in Asia, not Europe. Or it should have happened in a different century entirely. That's not just a small mistake. That's a crack in the foundation of what we call history. This isn't a theory made by stargazers with telescopes in their backyard. Professional astronomers have run these tests. They've matched up eclipses mentioned in ancient texts with modern simulations. And over again, something strange appears. The sky doesn't match the story. That's when the phantom time hypothesis comes into play. The idea that someone added years that never happened, that 300 years was slipped into the calendar like a forged page in a book. And if you're trying to fake a timeline, you better hope no one looks up. But the stars remember, and they don't care about politics or religion. One of the earliest signs of this problem came from studying eclipses recorded by Chinese astronomers. Their observations were incredibly accurate. They tracked the moon and the sun with exact dates and times. But when those same events were compared with events in Europe during the so-called Dark Ages, they didn't match. Sometimes they were off by decades, sometimes they just didn't exist. Even more strange are the gaps. Periods where no major celestial events seem to be recorded at all. As if people just stopped looking up, or stopped writing it down. But why would they? Unless someone erased the records later, or made sure the dates wouldn't expose the edits. Some scholars believe ancient calendars were rewritten not just to control time, but to place certain rulers in power at the right moment. If a king wanted to claim divine right, he might need to be born under a specific star. If a church council needed to erase a heresy, they might shift dates so that the heresy happened before the church even existed. It's time manipulation on a cosmic level, but no matter how clever the edit, the sky stays honest. Every eclipse leaves an echo. Every alignment leaves a shadow. And slowly those echoes are starting to expose the gaps in our history, the false years, the rearranged centuries. So the next time someone tells you we know exactly what happened and when, remember this. The truth might still be up there, hiding in plain sight, etched into the night sky, waiting to be heard. In the silence between the stars, there have always been people who ask too many questions, historians who dig too deep, linguists who decode forbidden texts, astronomers who notice the stars aren't lining up with the story we've been told. And time after time, those people seem to vanish. Not always with a bang, sometimes just a whisper. A career ruined, a reputation destroyed, a death no one can explain. These are the scholars who knew too much. Take Jean Hardouin, a Jesuit priest from the 1600s. He claimed most ancient texts were actually medieval forgeries. That history had been faked. That entire chunk of time was inserted like blank chapters filled with invented heroes and false prophets. People called him mad. His own church silenced him. After he died, most of his work was buried. Then there's Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician who looked at star charts and old records and came to a wild conclusion that our calendar was off. That history was repeating, that emperors and popes were being copied and pasted under new names. His ideas were mocked by the academic world, but no one could fully disprove them. They just stopped inviting him to conferences. Or look at scholars who tried to get access to the Vatican archives. Some got in, but when they found something odd, their research disappeared, or they were told they misunderstood. Some were later accused of fraud, others just stopped publishing altogether. And then there are the ones who died. Mysteriously, a historian in Germany falls from a balcony. A linguist in Italy drowns during a solo trip. A scholar in France disappears after giving a controversial lecture about timeline manipulation. These aren't just rumours. They're names, cases, questions that never got answers. Why does this happen? Because the cost of questioning official history is high, especially when that history is protected by power. And the Vatican isn't just a church. It's a global institution with ties to governments, intelligence agencies, and media. Challenging its version of the past is like pulling on a thread that unravels the whole world. Even those who survive the backlash often end up in exile. Their books pulled from shelves, their names were mocked in public, their discoveries labelled conspiracy instead of theory. It's not about debate. It's about erasure. But the irony is that many of these scholars weren't trying to cause chaos. They just wanted to understand. They saw cracks in the timeline, gaps in the record, patterns that didn't make sense, and they followed those clues until someone told them to stop. Some listened, some didn't. But all of them learned the same lesson. There are truths that come with a warning. Ask too many questions and you don't just lose your career. You might lose everything. Because in a world built on a fragile version of history, the most dangerous thing you can be is someone who remembers what we were never meant to know. The calendar on your wall might seem simple, just a way to track birthdays, holidays, and school breaks, but the truth is much deeper. Our calendar is not just a tool, it is a weapon, a device used to shape memory, control time, and erase the past. And the Vatican holds the blueprint. Long ago, we followed the Julian calendar. It was based on the movements of the sun and stars. But over centuries, it began to drift. The spring equinox came earlier. Important dates like Easter fell out of sync, and so the Church stepped in. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new system, the Gregorian calendar. At first, it seemed like a simple correction. 10 days were skipped. Thursday, October 4th, was followed by Friday, October 15th. Just like that, entire days were wiped from history. But that change was about more than astronomy. It was about power. You see, calendars do more than count time. They set the rhythm of belief, the timing of rituals, the cycles of fast and feast. If you control the calendar, you control the heartbeat of civilization. The Gregorian calendar placed Easter exactly where the Church wanted it. It aligned Christian holy days with a system they could manage, and it slowly erased the older pagan festivals tied to the seasons and the stars. What used to be natural became theological. But there's something strange. Not everyone adopted the new calendar right away. Protestant countries resisted. Orthodox Christians refused. Some people believed it was a trick to steal time itself, a way to cut them off from their roots. And maybe they were right, because once the Vatican held the clock, they could move it however they wanted. What if changing the calendar wasn't just about fixing errors? What if it was about hiding years that never existed? Or stitching together a timeline that looked seamless but was really missing entire chapters? Remember the phantom time hypothesis. What if the calendar shift helped cover up those lost centuries? What if the timeline we follow today was designed not to remember, but to forget? Even now, our calendar continues to shape us. School years, fiscal quarters, election cycles, all built on a structure designed centuries ago by a church with a plan. And that plan had nothing to do with convenience, it was about control. So when you mark a date, when you celebrate a holiday, When you think about where we are in time, ask yourself, who decided this? Why does this system feel so normal? And what did we lose when we gave one institution the power to define time itself? Because maybe time is not just a river we float down. Maybe it's a map. And the Vatican was holding the pen. It always starts with faith. That's what they tell you. That the church rose to guide the lost to truth. That its mission was light in a dark world. But behind that story is another one. A much older fear. Not of heretics or demons, or even the devil, but of losing control. The Vatican didn't just inherit power, it built it. One book, one law, one silence at a time. And it learned very quickly that knowledge was a double-edged sword. People who ask questions tend to see through stories. People who read too much tend to think for themselves. And that kind of thinking is dangerous when your authority is built on belief. So what was the original sin of the Vatican? It wasn't pride or greed. It was the decision to choose power over truth. It began when the Roman Empire fell and chaos followed. The church stepped in as the only voice left standing. But to lead a broken world, it had to do more than preach. It had to be rewritten, control the past, shape the future, hide what didn't fit. It wasn't about lies, it was about edits, quiet omissions, subtle changes. A book removed here, a date shifted there, a miracle inserted, a philosopher burned, all to protect the illusion that the church had always been right, always central, always chosen. But faith doesn't need control, fear does. The fear that people would remember the gods that came before, the fear that someone would discover old technologies that made the miracles look small, the fear that history would show other paths that didn't lead to Rome. So silence became a strategy. Burn the scrolls, ban the books, lock the knowledge behind stone walls and velvet ropes, call it heresy, and the people will help you bury it. But the silence wasn't perfect. Cracks formed. Curious minds started asking why entire centuries seemed empty. Why the stars didn't match the stories. Why the oldest maps showed lands we weren't supposed to know. And every time someone got too close, the church responded with the same tool it always used: fear. Because the truth was never the enemy. It was the threat to a carefully built world where questions were punishable and forgetting was rewarded. The Vatican's original sin was not about faith at all. It was about holding on to power at any cost, even if that cost was history itself. So ask yourself this: if truth is eternal, why does it need to be guarded? If faith is strong, why must it silence the past? And if the church serves the light, why has it spent so long hiding in the dark? Because maybe the greatest cover-up wasn't what they did, but why they did it. Not to protect your soul, but to protect their throne. They say history is written by the victors. But what if it was also edited by the fearful, carefully trimmed by those who wanted you to forget? A century can vanish in silence. And it did. There is a missing chapter in our story, a blank space where entire lives once were. Some call it the phantom time hypothesis. Others call it nonsense. But look closer. Why does the timeline between the fall of Rome and the rise of the church feel so strange? Why are the records from that period so thin, so quiet? Why does it feel like the world went to sleep? The truth is, this chapter was never lost. It was hidden, not by accident, but by design. Covered in layers of holy doctrine, rewritten by monks, erased by fear. And now we have a choice. We can keep pretending the silence was natural, or we can start digging. This isn't about being a scholar or a scientist. It's about being curious, looking at the world and asking if the story we've been told makes sense, if the stars above match the dates below, if the saints were real, if the popes all existed, if the vaults beneath the Vatican hide more than just parchment. Because the truth doesn't go away. It waits. It waits in old maps and dusty books, in ruins no one visits, in ancient machines that shouldn't exist, in languages that were silenced, in the whispers of those who remembered just enough to be dangerous. And now the question becomes, what are you going to do with that whisper? The Church wants you to believe that everything is accounted for, that time flows cleanly from Genesis to now, but that's the illusion. The timeline is a stage, and for 100 years the curtain dropped. Somewhere in that gap is the key. To lost civilizations, to stolen science, to a version of history that would make us question everything. And maybe that's why it was hidden, because if people knew how much had been taken from them, they would demand it back. They would question. They would remember. So this is your invitation. Don't just believe, explore. Don't just read, investigate. Don't just wonder, reclaim. Reclaim the years that were stolen, the stories that were rewritten, the names that were erased, the questions that were never meant to be asked. Because you are not too young, you are not too late, you are exactly where they didn't want you to be. Awake, and once your eyes open, there's no going back. There's only forward, into the silence they built, to find the truths they buried, and to finally remember the century they tried to erase.